The girl collapsed in Jack Malone's snow like a broken angel, her lips blue as death itself. But it wasn't her dying that stopped his heart. It was the recognition in her eyes when she whispered his name. A name he hadn't heard spoken in 23 years. Marshall Malone, she breathed through chattering teeth. My mother said, "You'd remember your promise." Jack had sworn on his wife's grave that he'd never take off Rebecca's coat again. Never risk loving someone enough to lose them. The thick wool jacket was all he had left of her, sewn with dying hands and lined with 23 years of grief. It was his armor against a world that took everything from those who dared to care. But the baby in the girl's arms was barely breathing. Jack's hands moved to the buttons before his mind could stop them, and he felt his carefully built walls crumble like sand. This was how it always started, with a choice between safety and conscience, between protecting yourself and protecting someone who needed you more. The last time he'd made this choice, his 8-year-old daughter had died calling his name while he was 300 miles away. Before we jump back in, comment where you're tuning in from. And if this story has touched you, make sure to subscribe because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The coat slipped from Jack's shoulders like 23 years of penance finally forgiven. The Montana wind bit through his shirt like teeth, but he wrapped the girl in warmth that smelled of lavender and lost love, and watched her dark eyes widen with something that looked like hope. "How do you know my name?" he whispered, lifting her carefully. "Because," she said, clutching the baby closer, 50 tribes have been looking for you." Jack had been watching from his kitchen window when she'd stumbled into his yard, a small figure in inadequate furs struggling against the Montana wind. The way she moved, favoring her left leg, clutching something precious to her chest, reminded him painfully of another child he'd failed to save. His daughter Emma, 8 years old, who died in his arms because he'd chosen duty over family, law over love. The morning ritual had been the same for 2 decades. Coffee at sunrise, check the boundaries, tend the horses, avoid thinking about the graves behind the cabin. It was a life built around forgetting, and it had been working until this moment. Now the girl lay crumpled in his snow like a broken bird, and Jack felt the familiar weight of choice crushing down on him. Help her and risk losing someone else. Leave her and live with another death on his conscience. "Damn," he whispered, already reaching for the door. The cold hit Jack like a physical blow as he stepped onto the porch, but it was nothing compared to the chill that went through him when he saw the girl's face. She couldn't be more than 13, with delicate features and dark hair matted with snow. In her arms, she clutched a bundle wrapped in rabbit fur, something small and precious that she protected even while freezing. But it was her eyes that stopped his heart. They were Emma's eyes, the same deep brown that had looked up at him 23 years ago when his daughter had begged him not to leave for the cattle drive that would keep him away when the fever came. "Please," the girl whispered in accented English, her voice barely audible above the wind. "My brother." Jack knelt beside her, his weathered hands hovering uncertainly over her trembling form. The last time he tried to help a freezing child, he'd been too late. Emma had died calling his name while he was 300 miles away, choosing money over family, duty over love. "How long have you been walking?" he asked, but the girl's eyes were already rolling back, consciousness slipping away like snow through fingers. That's when Jack made the choice that would change everything. His hands moved to the buttons of Rebecca's coat, the thick wool jacket she'd sewn with love and lined with prayers. For 23 years, it had been his shield against the world, his protection against the guilt that lived in his bones. "I'm sorry, Rebecca," he whispered, slipping the coat from his shoulders. The winter air bit through his thin shirt like teeth, but he wrapped the girl in the warmth that had carried him through 2 decades of grief. She stirred as the coat's warmth reached her, and Jack felt something crack open in his chest. The same protective instinct that had failed Emma, but might yet save this stranger's child. "What's your name?" he asked, lifting her carefully. "Ayana," she breathed against his chest. "Means eternal blossom." Jack carried her toward his cabin, the bundle still clutched in her arms, and wondered if redemption always came wrapped in second chances and bitter cold. Inside the cabin, Jack built up the fire until it roared like a living thing, casting dancing shadows across walls lined with memories he'd tried to forget. Photographs of Rebecca and Emma watched from the mantel as he settled Ayana on the old sofa, Rebecca's coat still wrapped around her small frame. The bundle in her arms shifted, and Jack heard a sound that made his blood freeze, the weak cry of a baby. "Your brother," he said, understanding flooding through him. Not a brother her age, but an infant she'd been protecting with her own body heat. Ayana's eyes fluttered open, immediately seeking the bundle. "He needs milk. Warmth." "I couldn't." Her voice broke, and Jack saw the defeat in her young face. The look of someone who'd carried responsibility too heavy for her years. "I have milk," Jack said quickly, moving toward the kitchen. "Goat's milk from the neighbor's farm. It'll do." But as he prepared the bottle, his mind raced backward through memory and forward through implications. A native girl alone in a blizzard with a baby, speaking English, wearing clothes that suggested wealth rather than poverty. This wasn't a simple case of travelers caught in bad weather. "Ayana," he said gently, returning with the warm milk. "Where's your family? What are you running from?" The girl's eyes hardened with a wisdom too old for her face. "Dead," she said simply. "All dead except us." Jack felt the familiar weight of other people's tragedies settling on his shoulders. He'd sworn off involvement, off caring, off the possibility of failing someone else. But looking at this girl, barely older than Emma had been, he realized some promises were meant to be broken. "Who killed them?" he asked, though part of him didn't want to know. "Soldiers," Ayana whispered, accepting the bottle and testing its temperature on her wrist with practiced care. "But not just soldiers. White men in suits. Government men who said our treaty was, how do you say, not real anymore." Jack's blood turned cold. He'd heard whispers of such things, federal commissioners declaring treaties invalid, using military force to clear valuable land, covering it all up with paperwork and official seals. But whispers were different from seeing the victims sitting in your own cabin. The Crow Creek Treaty, he guessed. The one that guaranteed your people permanent settlement rights. Ayana's eyes widened with surprise. "You know of it?" Jack knew more than he wanted to admit. 23 years ago, he'd been a different man, Marshal Jack Malone, tasked with ensuring treaty compliance, protecting native settlements from illegal encroachment. He'd been good at his job, too good, until the cattle drive that took him away when Emma needed him most. After Emma died, after Rebecca followed her into the ground 6 months later, Jack had hung up his badge and retreated to this isolated ranch. He'd told himself he was done with other people's problems, finished with the weight of responsibility that had cost him everything he loved. But responsibility had a way of finding him anyway. "What's your tribal name?" he asked. "Your real name, not the English one." Ayana hesitated, then spoke a word in her native tongue that sounded like wine through aspen leaves. "It means she who carries the future," she translated. "My grandfather gave it to me when I was born." "And the baby?" "Dakota. It means friend to everyone." Her voice softened as she looked down at the infant, who was drinking hungrily from the bottle. "He's not just my brother. He's more important than that." Jack felt puzzle pieces clicking together in his mind, forming a picture he didn't want to see. "He's the chief's son, isn't he? The heir to tribal leadership." Ayana's silence was answer enough. "And you're not just his sister," Jack continued, understanding flooding through him like ice water. "You're his protector. Maybe the only one left who knows who he really is." "The soldiers came at night," Ayana said, her young voice carrying the weight of witnessed horror. "They said the treaty was void, that our land belonged to railroad companies now. My father tried to show them the papers, the official seals, but they burned everything. Then they—" She couldn't finish, but Jack could imagine. He'd seen the aftermath of such clearances before, back when he'd worn a badge and still believed in justice. "How did you escape?" "My mother hid us in the sacred cave before they came to the chief's lodge. She said to find the old marshal who lived alone, the one who once protected our people. She said you would remember your oath." Jack's hands began to shake. Rebecca's coat suddenly felt heavier on Ayana's shoulders, as if weighted with the ghosts of promises he'd made and broken. "Your mother knew me," he said. "It wasn't a question. She said you saved her brother once, long ago, before you lost your own family and disappeared." Ayana's dark eyes searched his face. "She said you were the only white man who ever kept his word to our people." The memory hit Jack like a physical blow, a young brave caught between two war parties, saved by Jack's intervention and testimony. The gratitude in the tribal elder's eyes. The promise Jack had made to always stand between the innocent and those who would harm them. A promise he'd broken when Emma needed him most. Now, 23 years later, that promise had found him again in the form of a freezing girl and the baby she protected with her life. Outside, the wind howled with increasing fury, and Jack realized this blizzard wasn't natural weather. It was the kind of storm that provided cover for men doing things they didn't want witnessed. The kind of storm that would hide the approach of hunters tracking their escaped prey. "Ayanna," he said carefully, "how long have you been running?" 3 days, she whispered. "But they're still following. I see their fires at night, hear their horses. They won't stop until—" She didn't need to finish. Jack knew what happened to witnesses, to inconvenient heirs, to anyone who could challenge the legal fiction that justified genocide. But he also knew something else, something that had been eating at him for 23 years. Sometimes the only way to honor the dead was to protect the living, even if it meant risking everything you had left. "They won't find you here," Jack said, the words coming out with more certainty than he felt. "I give you my word." Ayanna studied his face for a long moment, then nodded. "My mother said you were a man of honor. Even broken honor is stronger than no honor at all." As if summoned by her words, a sound drifted through the storm. The distant whinny of horses, the muffled voices of men who rode through blizzards with deadly purpose. Jack moved to the window and peered through the frost-covered glass. Through the swirling snow, he could make out lights moving in the distance, too steady and purposeful to be anything but pursuit. "How many are following you?" he asked. 20 soldiers, Ayanna replied, "and 5 men in dark suits who give the orders." Jack felt his old instincts awakening, the tactical mind that had once made him one of the territory's most effective marshals. 25 men against 1 retired lawman, a teenage girl, and a baby. The math was simple and brutal. But math had never accounted for the power of desperation, the strength that came from having nothing left to lose, the fury of a man who'd failed once and refused to fail again. "Ayanna," he said, moving away from the window, "I need you to tell me everything about these men. Their names, their orders, what they're really after. Because in about an hour, they're going to reach this cabin, and I need to know exactly what kind of evil we're facing." The girl clutched her baby brother closer, Rebecca's coat falling open to reveal traditional beadwork that spoke of royal bloodlines and sacred responsibilities. "The leader," she said, "calls himself Colonel Morrison. But the men in suits, they're the ones who matter. They have papers that say our entire nation never existed, that our treaties were signed by imposters, that our land was always theirs." Jack's blood turned to ice water. Morrison, he knew that name. A man who'd built his career on pacifying tribes that stood in the way of progress, who'd mastered the art of legal genocide wrapped in official documents. A man Jack had once arrested for selling guns to hostile tribes, only to watch him walk free when territorial judges declared the evidence inadmissible. This wasn't just about protecting 2 refugees from the storm. This was about confronting the corruption that had been eating at the heart of the territory for decades, the systematic theft disguised as law and order. This was about choosing between the safety of solitude and the dangerous responsibility of standing up for what was right. Jack looked at Emma's photograph on the mantel, at Rebecca's sewing basket still filled with the threads of interrupted projects, at the baby sleeping peacefully in the coat his wife had made with dying hands. For 23 years, he'd been running from responsibility, hiding from the possibility of failure. But some fights found you whether you wanted them or not. And some promises, once made, echoed through generations until someone was brave enough to keep them. The knock came at exactly midnight, polite and patient, as if death itself had learned manners. Jack had been expecting it for hours, sitting in his rocking chair with his rifle across his knees while Ayanna and baby Dakota slept on the sofa. Rebecca's coat rose and fell with the girl's breathing, and Jack found strange comfort in watching love protect innocence once again. "Marshal Malone," a cultured voice called through the door. "I know you're in there. We need to talk." Jack didn't answer immediately. He'd heard that voice before. Colonel Morrison, a man who spoke softly and carried the weight of government authority like a weapon. A man who'd learned to make murder sound like policy. "It's been a long time, Colonel," Jack finally replied, not moving from his chair. "Last I heard, you were facing court-martial for arms dealing." "Ancient history," Morrison replied with audible amusement. "Amazing how charges disappear when you're serving the greater good. May I come in? This storm is rather inhospitable." So is genocide, Jack said. But that's never stopped you before. The silence stretched long enough for Jack to hear the whispered conversations outside, the careful positioning of men who knew how to surround a building without making noise. 25 against 1. Morrison was taking no chances. You have something that belongs to the United States government, Morrison said finally. 2 fugitives who escaped lawful relocation. Return them, and you can go back to your peaceful retirement. Jack looked at Ayanna, who had awakened at the sound of voices but remained still, her dark eyes reflecting firelight and determination. In her arms, Dakota slept with the innocent trust of childhood, unaware that his very existence threatened powerful men's carefully laid plans. Relocation, Jack repeated. Is that what you're calling it now? The Crow Creek Band was illegally occupying federal land under fraudulent treaties, Morrison replied. We had legal authority to remove them to proper reservation boundaries. Legal authority signed by men who never had the right to cede that land in the first place, Jack countered. Treaties written in English and signed by chiefs who couldn't read, backed by guns pointed at children. The law is the law, Marshal. You of all people should understand that. Jack felt bitter laughter rising in his throat. I understood it once, right up until I realized the law was being written by thieves and enforced by murderers. Another long silence. Then Morrison's voice carried a different tone, less diplomatic, more threatening. Open the door, Malone. We can do this easy or hard, but we're leaving with those fugitives. Over my dead body, Jack said, and meant it. That can be arranged, Morrison replied. But first, let me tell you what you're really protecting. That girl isn't just some tribal runaway. She's carrying proof that could unravel years of careful legal work, decades of legitimate business arrangements. The boy she protects isn't just an orphan. He's a walking treaty violation that could cost important people millions of dollars. Jack felt pieces clicking together in his mind. He's not just the chief's son. He's proof that the chief was legitimate, that the treaties were real, that everything you've built is founded on lies. He's an inconvenience, Morrison corrected. One that needs to disappear before Congress starts asking uncomfortable questions about territorial land policies. That's when Jack understood the full scope of what he was facing. This wasn't just about clearing one band of troublesome natives. This was about eliminating evidence that could expose a network of corruption reaching from Montana to Washington, D.C. How many others have you killed? Jack asked. How many children have died to protect your boss's investments? Fewer than will die if this precedent stands, Morrison replied coldly. These people need to learn that resistance is futile, that the march of civilization can't be stopped by sentiment and outdated treaties. Jack stood slowly, his rifle held ready but not yet aimed. Through the frosted window, he could see shapes moving in the snow, soldiers positioning themselves for assault, men in dark suits directing the operation with the precision of experienced killers. Ayanna, he said quietly, take Dakota to the root cellar. There's a tunnel that leads to the barn. If this goes bad, you run for the reservation and don't look back. I won't leave you to face this alone, the girl replied, her young voice carrying steel that reminded Jack of Rebecca's quiet strength. You're not leaving me, Jack said, echoing words from another lifetime. You're protecting what matters most. That boy is the future, your people's future, maybe even mine. He's worth more than any of our lives. My grandfather always said, Ayanna whispered, that some fights are so important that losing them with honor is better than winning them with shame. Jack felt his heart expand with pride and terror. This child, this remarkable, brave child, understood something that had taken him 23 years to learn, that some things were worth dying for, and protecting innocence was first among them. Outside, Morrison's patience finally ran out. You have 30 seconds, Malone. Send out the fugitives, or we come in shooting. Jack moved to the window and saw the full scope of the force arrayed against him. Not just soldiers, but professional killers, men who specialized in making problems disappear. These weren't Indian fighters or cavalry troops. These were assassins in uniform, backed by the full authority of a government that had decided genocide was good business. You want them? Jack called back. Come and take them. The first gunshot shattered the night air, followed immediately by the crash of splintering wood as boots kicked in the back door. Jack dove behind the overturned table, returning fire at the shapes pouring through the smoke-filled doorway. But this time was different. This time, he wasn't fighting alone. Through the chaos of gunfire and shouting, Jack heard something that made his heart soar. War cries echoing across the valley, growing closer by the second. Not just one or two voices, but dozens, hundreds, a sound like thunder rolling down from the mountains. Ayanna heard it too, and her face split into the first genuine smile Jack had seen from her. "My message," she whispered. "They got my message." "What message?" Jack demanded, reloading his rifle by feel while bullets splintered the wall above his head. "Before I ran," Ayanna said, "I sent signals to all the scattered bands, all the survivors who escaped to different reservations. I told them where the future was hidden, where the last hope would make his stand." The war cries grew louder, accompanied by the thunder of hundreds of horses converging on the little cabin from every direction. Through the broken windows, Jack saw Morrison's confident assault suddenly falter as soldiers realized they were no longer the hunters. They were the hunted. 50 tribes, Ayanna said with fierce pride. 50 nations who haven't ridden together in 100 years. All coming to protect one small boy who carries their tomorrow in his blood. The battle that followed would be remembered in tribal songs for generations. Not just for its fury, but for what it represented. The moment when scattered, broken peoples found unity in protecting innocence, when justice rode out of the storm to confront those who thought they were beyond consequences. When the dawn came, Morrison and his men were gone. Those who survived fleeing into the wilderness they'd thought to conquer. And in the growing light, Jack saw something that took his breath away. The valley around his cabin was filled with warriors from nations that had been enemies for centuries, all dismounting in respectful silence, all united by the crying of one small baby who represented hope reborn. The sunrise painted the snow-covered valley in shades of gold and crimson, illuminating a sight that would have seemed impossible just hours before. 50 tribal leaders, representing nations scattered across 1,000 miles of territory, sat in a great circle around Jack's cabin. Warriors who had fought each other in their youth now shared pipes and spoke in the old languages of diplomacy and alliance. At the center of it all, baby Dakota slept peacefully in Ayanna's arms, still wrapped in Rebecca's coat, unconscious of the destiny that rested on his tiny shoulders. Jack stood on his porch, rifle laid aside, watching the most extraordinary council he'd ever witnessed. Chiefs who hadn't spoken to each other in decades were finding common ground in protection of this one child. Ancient grievances were being set aside in favor of an unprecedented unity. Marshal Malone called a voice from the circle. An elderly man with silver braids and the bearing of nobility approached the porch. "I am Chief Standing Bear of the Ponca. My granddaughter tells me you kept the old promises." Jack looked down at his hands, hands that had held his dying daughter, that had buried his beloved wife, that had pulled the trigger to protect innocence just hours before. "I did what anyone would do." "No," Standing Bear replied gently. "You did what few men would do. You chose love over safety, honor over comfort. You remembered that some oaths transcend the men who make them." Other chiefs approached, each offering words that cut straight to Jack's heart. They spoke of debts that could never be repaid, of respect earned through sacrifice, of the bond between protector and protected that transcended race or creed. But it was Ayanna who spoke the words that changed everything. "Uncle Jack," she said, using the term that meant family by choice rather than blood. "The chiefs have been talking. They want to offer you something." Jack knelt beside her, studying the baby's peaceful face. Dakota had Rebecca's stubborn chin and Emma's trusting eyes, and Jack felt his heart expand with a love he'd thought was buried forever. "What kind of offer?" he asked. "Adoption," Chief Standing Bear said simply. "Not just by one tribe, but by all 50 nations represented here. You would become the boy's guardian under tribal law, his protector and teacher until he comes of age." Jack felt the world tilt beneath his feet. "I don't understand." "The boy needs a father who will teach him to walk between worlds," another chief explained. "Someone who understands both white law and native tradition, who can prepare him for the day when he reclaims his birthright. And Ayanna needs a family," added a woman chief whose scars spoke of battles survived and wisdom earned. "She has carried adult responsibilities on child's shoulders long enough." Jack looked at the girl who had stumbled into his life wrapped in winter and tragedy, who had trusted him with the most precious thing her people possessed. In her dark eyes, he saw Emma's courage and Rebecca's strength, and realized that love didn't die with loss. It multiplied with each heart willing to risk caring again. What about the legal complications? Jack asked. Morrison may be gone, but the corruption that sent him isn't finished. There will be other attempts to eliminate witnesses, other efforts to seize tribal lands. Which is why the boy needs legal protection as well as traditional guardianship, Standing Bear replied. You're still a federal marshal, even if you haven't worn the badge in 20 years. Your oath still carries weight in white courts. Jack felt the old weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders, but this time it felt different, not crushing, but stabilizing, like an anchor that would keep him steady in whatever storms were coming. I failed before, he said quietly. I lost my own daughter because I chose duty over family. And now you have the chance to choose both, Ayanna said with the wisdom that seemed too old for her years. To be the father you couldn't be then, to keep the promises you couldn't keep before. Jack looked around at the assembled chiefs, at the unprecedented alliance that had formed around one sleeping baby. He thought of Emma, who had died calling for a father who wasn't there. He thought of Rebecca, who had sewn love into every stitch of the coat that now protected another man's child. He thought of the 23 years he'd spent running from responsibility, hiding from the possibility of failing someone else. If I do this, he said slowly, if I take on this responsibility, I need your word that it won't be temporary. I won't be a caretaker who hands him back when it's convenient. If I become his father, I become his father forever. Forever, Standing Bear agreed solemnly. Through whatever comes. Through the battles we'll face when powerful men try to reclaim what they think they own. Through the years of preparation before he's ready to lead. Through the joy of watching him grow and the sorrow of eventual loss. Jack felt tears burning his eyes as he reached out to touch Takoda's tiny hand. The baby's fingers closed around his thumb with surprising strength, and Jack felt the last of his walls crumble. Then yes, he whispered. Yes, I'll be his father. I'll be both their guardian and protector. I'll teach them to walk between worlds and stand strong in both. The circle of chiefs erupted in voices raised in celebration, war cries that spoke of joy rather than battle. Songs that welcomed new family into the great circle of belonging. But it was the quiet sound of Ayanna's tears that touched Jack's heart most deeply. Tears of relief, of gratitude, of a child finally allowed to stop carrying the weight of the world alone. Uncle Jack, she whispered, there's something else. Something I haven't told you about why the tribes united so quickly. What's that, little one? It wasn't just to protect Takoda, she said, her voice soft with wonder. It was to honor a promise made long ago. My mother wasn't the only one you saved. All those years when you wore the badge. You protected dozens of our people, kept promises when other lawmen broke theirs, stood between innocence and those who would harm it. Jack felt his breath catch. I was just doing my job. You were being who you truly are, Ayanna corrected. A protector, a man who chooses love over hate, mercy over revenge, hope over despair. The chiefs remember. The people remember. And now we're returning the gift you gave us. A family to belong to, children to raise, a purpose worth living for. As if summoned by her words, Takoda opened his eyes and looked up at Jack with the trusting gaze of childhood. In those dark depths, Jack saw his future, teaching a boy to ride and shoot and read, watching him grow from infant to child to man, preparing him for the day when he would reclaim his birthright and lead his people into a better tomorrow. But more than that, he saw his past redeemed. Emma's death given meaning through Takoda's life, Rebecca's love continuing through the coat that would protect another generation, his own failures transformed into wisdom that could guide young feet along safer paths. Epilogue, Spring's Promise. 3 months later, Jack stood in the garden behind his cabin, watching Ayanna teach Takoda to take his first steps among the wildflowers Rebecca had planted years before. The baby wore Rebecca's coat cut down to his size, and his laughter echoed across the valley like music. The legal battles had been fierce but brief. When 50 tribal nations spoke with one voice, when dozens of chiefs testified about Jack's integrity and service, when evidence of systematic corruption reached sympathetic ears in Washington, justice moved with surprising speed. New treaties were negotiated, stolen lands were returned, and baby Takota's legitimacy as a tribal heir was recognized under both native and federal law. Morrison and his surviving men faced federal charges for their role in what newspapers were calling the Montana Massacres. The men in dark suits had disappeared into the shadows from which they'd emerged, but their network of corruption had been exposed and dismantled. Most importantly, Takota was safe, protected by law, surrounded by family, watched over by an alliance that had grown stronger with each passing day. "Dada," the baby called, reaching chubby arms toward Jack. The word still made Jack's heart expand with wonder. This child who would never know hunger or cold or the fear of abandonment, who would grow up surrounded by love from two worlds. "Coming, little chief," Jack replied, scooping up the boy and spinning him around until he giggled with delight. Ayana looked up from the flower bed where she'd been planting seeds for the summer garden. At 16 now, she'd grown into the beauty and strength her mother had seen in her, but the old wisdom remained in her dark eyes. "He'll be walking soon," she observed. "Then running. Then riding. Before we know it, he'll be a man ready to reclaim his birthright." "That's a long way off," Jack said, settling Takota on his shoulders. "For now, he's just our boy, our son and brother, and hope for tomorrow." "The best kind of hope," Ayana agreed. "The kind that grows from love and sacrifice, that survives the worst storms and blooms again in spring." As they walked back toward the cabin, Jack caught sight of Rebecca's photograph in the window and felt her presence like a warm embrace. She would have loved these children, would have delighted in Takota's laughter and Ayana's wisdom. Her final gift, the coat that had protected a freezing girl, had become the thread that bound three broken souls into something stronger than any of them could have been alone. In the distance, smoke rose from the fires of the permanent camp that had grown up around Jack's ranch. Representatives from all 50 tribes maintained a presence there, ensuring that Takota would grow up knowing all the traditions of his people while also learning the skills he'd need to navigate the white world. It was unprecedented, this alliance, this unity, this commitment to raising one special child as the symbol of a better future. But then, Jack reflected, the best things in life usually were unprecedented. Love that transcended loss, faith that survived failure, hope that bloomed again after the longest winter. That night, as Jack tucked Takota into the cradle he'd carved from Rebecca's oak hope chest, the baby looked up at him with those knowing dark eyes and smiled. "Sleep well, little chief," Jack whispered. "Tomorrow we'll teach you to ride. Next week, we'll start your letters. And someday, when you're ready, you'll take your place as the leader your people need." But that was years away. For now, there was just this: a baby sleeping safely in his father's love, a teenage girl reading by lamplight in the next room, and a promise finally fulfilled after 23 years of carrying it like a wound. Outside, the first stars appeared in the Montana sky, and Jack could swear he heard Rebecca's voice on the wind. "Well done, my love. Well done." The winter was over. Spring had come at last,